people, but not necessarily in the microphone for an average day's class, so this is a little bit different. Hi, thank you for coming out this afternoon. I'm Jessie Lanterman Novotny, and this is my colleague, Michael Cunningham-Minnick, and one of our research students, Austin Whitwright. And so today we're going to present to you a compilation of some research projects we've been doing on bee nesting. And this is an interesting new topic for us because in the realm of bee biologists, it's one that frequently gets conveniently ignored and set to the side. Bee biologists know a lot about bees foraging on flowers, but nesting biology is relatively poorly understood. And so when Mike came here last year, we were both really excited to find out that we were both working on some new novel nesting research, and we're like, awesome. And so now we're embarking on some new projects together. So I'll tell you about one that I did, one that he did before he came, and then how we're putting those big ideas together and trying to apply them to better land management at the field station and involving Hiram students. So if you're here from if you're one of the underclassmen, maybe you could help us work on this sometime in the future. This is a picture of one of my favorite bees, which is a specialist on hibiscus, and I just love the way that it's like bottoms up in the nest. But it is a fairly rare sight, even for highly trained bee biologists, to see that happening. And so you'll notice I didn't actually take that picture myself, even though this is a talk about bee nesting, because it is super hard to find the nest. I'll tell you more about that and some tricks that we have established for finding them and doing a better job. So a little disclaimer first. There were no scientists harmed in the making of this talk today, and I don't think I got stung even once during this research. Did you know? Oh, yeah. We probably jinxed ourselves now. But if you came here today expecting to hear stories about how we ran for our lives from a swarm of angry bees, come back next year because we're doing more research this summer on it. And so the swarm of angry bees could still happen. All right. There are many, many kinds of insects that visit flowers, but not a lot that are specialized to rear their young with pollen. Bees are particularly well adapted of all the different insects that visit flowers in order to collect pollen. They have a very fuzzy, hairy body. They have specialized learning behaviors for learning to handle flowers and recognize them. And they are required to feed their young pollen. That's what sets them apart from wasps and many other flower visiting insects that are there just for the nectar part, but not necessarily doing the plant the service of transporting the pollen. We have many, many kinds of native bees. The honeybee is actually not native. How many of you already knew that? Little fun factoid. Yes, the word is getting out. We're trying really hard. Honeybee is basically an invasive species in the realm of bee biologists. But we're not total snobs. I do like honey too. But the many other wild bees that we have are equally effective and important pollinators as honeybees too. So that's what this talk focuses on, is wild bees, and especially nesting, since that's so poorly understood. Here's a close-up of some bees on one of my favorite plants to watch for flower visiting insects. This is a great big bowl thistle. If you've ever stepped on one of those, you would know it. It's not a normal thistle, and they provide really excellent flower resources for bees in terms of wildflowers and weeds. And this is a great big fuzzy bumblebee queen, one of the most common species of bumblebees here, visiting an apple flower. Just to remind you that bees are very important for most crop pollinators, or most crop species here. And most of our crop species that are not cereal grains, like corn and wheat and oats, set larger and better fruit and more of it if they are bee pollinated. So worldwide, there are about 20,000 different species of bees. We cannot ID them all yet, but we're working on it. And in Ohio, there's about 330, which is a much more manageable number. And if that number seems kind of small to you, it's because the greatest bee diversity worldwide is actually in desert areas, which sounds strange, right? Where it's really dry and there's not a lot of flowers consistently. but they harbor huge bee diversity in deserty areas because there's a lot of specialist bees timed with very short-lived flowers, so it gives rise to a lot of specialist interactions. But that's not the bee fauna of Ohio. Our average bees in Ohio tend to be diet generalists that collect pollen from a variety of plants, or at least more than one. And they usually have an annual life cycle so that the adult is active for just 1 to 3 months out of the year, and then that adult dies and leaves behind as many offspring as it possibly can in its brief time in the sun, and then those offspring come out next year. So kind of short window of activity, but generalist diet while they're out there. And their primary nesting strategies for the purposes of biologists hunting for nests are these three. They could nest in hollowed out cavities like an abandoned chipmunk hole that they improve upon, or so there's a bumblebee nest in probably in an old chipmunk or mouse burrow. And here's another nesting strategy that applies to about 25% of our bee fauna. They can nest in hollow twigs like that, in which case they're kind of easy to find for us, and we like that. But the majority of our bee species here, by far, about 70 to 80%, depending who you ask, nest in the soil like this. And if you only watched bees visiting flowers where they're easiest to find, you would miss all of that critical part of their life cycle that happens. You miss most of what they do, which is really a big gaping hole in the field of pollinator biology. So since people like to study them when they're visiting flowers, they're easy to find, they're fun to watch, but so we've decided to challenge ourselves by figuring out what they're doing most of the rest of the time. So I took a rough guess. I couldn't find this anywhere published, any scientific study that said exactly what they do, what percentage of time they spend doing different tasks. But we know from personal observation that the feeding themselves is like an afterthought. They do very, very little self-care time because the adults are only alive for about a month and then they're gone. And they spend about half their time just resting too, because it's dark for about half of 24 hours of the day, and they hide out in the nest. And most of the rest of the time is spent doing some kind of reproductive behavior. And that's the part of their time that is the only thing that matters for the continuation of that species in that particular place and the insurance of pollination services that they provide. So. Okay. It's really easy to find them on flowers, to recap. Super hard to find the nest, and I can tell you why. Picture the last time you saw a sweat bee. Has everybody seen a sweat bee before? Maybe like licking salt off your arm in your sweat. And so it might surprise you to learn that about a third of our species of native bees in Ohio are sweat bees. They're tiny and very difficult to find, even on flowers. And so now imagine finding a nest that such a tiny bee would create in the ground, because most of them are soil nesting. It's really hard, even if you know what you're looking for. So the nests are tiny. They're often hidden in vegetation, like the picture on the right. Can anybody see the nest hole in that picture? Do you see anything that looks like it could be an insect nest? You see it's going? I think so. And this is an easy one to find compared to what a lot of them look like, because this one has a little turret right there. So there's the bee nest hole, and that is tiny, tiny, like 2 millimeters in diameter across the total width of the nest hole. Just the right size for the bee to shimmy its tiny body down in there to provision resources for its young and to lay an egg, the brood cell. Those nests can happen 6 inches to 3 feet underground, and they may or may not vary the entrance to the nest when they're done with it. And plus, those are only available for about 1 month out of the year. So you add all that together, you're starting to get a sense of why a lot of even pollinator biologists kind of conveniently ignore this, what's going on with nesting. But we are not content to ignore this. No, we've developed a series of research projects to try to uncover this big story of bee nesting. So today we'll kind of give you a showcase of 4 projects that we've been working on that tell the story of our approach to uncovering bee nesting. And we'll start out, as is common in biology, if you don't know much about a topic, you start with a survey, at least in biology, where you go out and you pick a variety of habitats where you think that things should be happening in, whether it's birds or caterpillars or true bugs or anything, and just observe what nature has to tell you and try to figure out patterns in why and what is happening. And then the next phase, or the gold standard of science, is to start doing manipulative experiments where you pick the most important variables from your survey and try to apply them in a controlled setting and tease apart the effects on bee nesting in this case. So we'll start out by telling you about a small-scale survey here in Northeast Ohio, and then I'll pass the ball to Mike to tell you about a broad-scale regional survey in the whole Great Lakes region, and then about 2 experiments that we're running with management applications in 2 different habitats that are most important for bee nesting, and they kind of complement each other. So we have 2 experiments going in grasslands for better managing grasslands for bee nesting, and then 1 so far in the forest, but to be determined more added. And there's my friend, that same hibiscus bee again, a nice shot of it poking its head out of the nest, which is a rare sight to see. So the first survey that I want to tell you about, first one in this little series of 4 experiments that tells the whole story, took place here in northeastern Ohio, just to learn more about nesting and develop the eye for where to find them. I embarked on the survey of old golf courses, actually, that have been converted to parks. How many of you guys play golf? Maybe only 1 out of, say, like 30. That's right, that mimics the overall population in Ohio. Maybe it's a dying art, I'm sorry. But for whatever reason, there's a lot of golf courses that have recently gone out of business. And the park district goes, ooh, look at that. A big, big plot of land, which doesn't happen really anymore. It wasn't uncommon in our grandparents' day to buy a 100-acre farm, but now it's super uncommon to get a large parcel of land together that is a mixture of habitats. And so I think that they're probably going to be pretty valuable as wildlife refuges if the park district keeps it together and preserves it. And so I found 3 of these golf courses that I call retired golf courses, like out-of-play golf courses that have been converted to parklands, and chose that for the setting of this bee nesting experiment because they have a variety of habitats, some of which are very unusual for Northeast Ohio. There's not a lot of places with naturally occurring pits of sand in the middle of a grassland. Like I don't golf myself much, but I've learned some from looking at the abandoned golf courses. And so the putting greens and tee boxes are also interesting, where you hit the ball from and where it's going to, because they constructed a great big mound of sand and put grass that never gets taller than this on there. It's very mysterious and impressive to a biologist who's like, that's not natural, insects are gonna love it. This is great. And so that was my thinking behind this. And the other cool thing about golf courses, they were born to be science experiments because they have a replicated design. They have 18 holes already, so plenty of room to experiment. So in this project, I asked this question of how valuable are golf courses turned parklands for bee nesting habitat? And I recruited some students to help me with this over the course of 2 years. And some of them are here. Hi guys, some of you are here. And they've been involved in various stages of the project, maybe some field work or some curation of specimens after the fact. I tried to involve them in different aspects of it. And this is one of the golf courses. This one I liked. It's recently out of play. This is in Solon. And it was a good testing ground for my experiment because it's not yet open to the public as a park. And so I didn't get a ton of people walking their dogs messing with my tracks. But the other 2, very much open to the public. And so 2 were in Geauga Park District, 1 in Chesterland, Orchard Hills Golf Course, 1 in Newberry, Veterans Legacy Woods, and then that 1 in Solon. And in a good science experiment, you would have a replicated design for any variable you have. But in this case, because this was a preliminary survey, and it's hard to find that many golf courses, I thought we were doing pretty good with 3 of them in 1 county or 2 counties. It's hard to find a lot. So these 3 span an age gradient that's not replicated of different ages, how long they've been out of play as a golf course, and how long the park has owned them and restored them. Okay, and the first thing I was interested in upon each site visit, and I went during times of peak bee nesting in the season, and that is in April and May, and then again in July when there's a late summer flush of new species that come out. And on each site visit, I searched for nests just as you would imagine, the old-fashioned way, like hands and knees digging through grass. It was at times fruitful, at times very much not, which is true of biology, right? Sometimes you find what you seek, sometimes not. And so I searched 4 different habitat types: putting green, sand pit, turf, like just the fairway, and then the adjacent forest in close proximity, which is also often an experimental no-no. You want things to be far enough apart to be independent in a science experiment, but this is a survey, this is a getting to know you kind of thing. And I wanted the comparisons to be super obvious to me, who didn't know a lot of nesting. If there were differences to be found, I needed them to be in my face obvious. So here's what I was looking for when I was hunting for nesting activity. This is in the forest. Did everybody see the bee? Awesome, okay. This is, that's about as big as they get. That one's a bumblebee queen, searching for a nest site in the forest, popping in and out of little holes that look non-existent to my human eye in the leaf litter, but they can find readily. Such are their amazing senses for detecting things important to them. Here's another one in the grassland habitat instead, in a little bare patch of ground. Can you see the bee on that one? There she is. That's a relatively large sweat bee. It would be about 1 centimeter, the size of the fingernail on your index finger, probably. So those 2 were good. Like seeing that happening, where they're doing things that are not foraging, I'm like, yeah, I'm getting the hang of this. And then when you see this is the gold standard, or one of the gold standards of bee nesting. That bee is not just flying to and fro, she's actually digging a burrow to see it happening. And it happened quicker than I thought. How long would it take you to dig a hole in the ground the size of your body? Wow. This bee did it in 2 minutes in that sand nesting pit. Amazing. And then she was gone. So if I hadn't happened to be there at that exact moment, I wouldn't have seen it. And I feel that way a lot about nesting research in general. And that's the way a lot of biology, outdoor biology is. But we who embrace it love that spirit of discovery. So I searched for nests. I did some other conventional kinds of trapping methods too, since, like I just told you, it's really tricky to find the nests. And you have to be there at just the right place and time. And you have to assume that you're not seeing like 10 times more than what you actually found. So to try to buffer for that, I did catch and kill some bees too. I'm sorry. If that offends you, I know you're probably all nature lovers in here, as am I. But in the name of science and documenting use of habitats for different bees, I selectively sampled some to go into the museum. So here's some students that I joined to net bees with me. And we are sorting our catch at lunchtime. We sorted them by a flower that they came from so that we can figure out what bees species are using what and where they're doing it in this overall complex habitat. I also employed a method that Mike used too, and is standard in a lot of bee surveys, where you put out little colored cups of soapy water that is just a little bit horrible, but they mimic flowers such that the bee goes, ooh, big flower, lots of nectar. And the little cups are about this big in diameter. They don't have to be very big, because bees are really good at what they do, at finding flowers. And so we're flying over from great height, ooh, big flower, fly in, and there's soap in the water, which they don't know, because they can't taste it. And it breaks up the surface tension, so that when they fall in, they drown. And then I collect them, pin them, and put them in the museum, after I've learned about who is the flying bear. I also tried this scrappy method of putting tents on the ground to collect things that were emerging out of the ground. I went, well, if I can't see them while I'm there, let's double my observation time and putting out passive traps that collect them while I'm at home sleeping. And so I put out those, but that was a colossal failure. So they just, you'd have to absolutely cover the ground, the entire ground everywhere. I need 1,000 students to put out 1 million traps to learn anything from that. It's much more fruitful just to search. So, okay, here's what I thought would happen. I thought the sandy habitats would be rocking it, because in the bee published scientific literature, all these habitats all over the world that say that there's rare and wonderful and perplexing specialist bees that are affiliated with sand habitats, some of which Mike will tell you about in his sandy barren forest opening project. So I thought the sand habitats would be great, and the bees nesting in the forest. I had this naive idea that I knew better than 400 million years of evolution and how they should pick a nest site. And went, surely if there's sand available, why would they bother digging in the forest floor? They will flock from the forest to the sand pits. And here's the sand pit, what that looks like. One of the more obvious ones. Do you think that is what happened? So the bees did not respect my wishes. I'm rude of them. And some of them did indeed nest in the sandy areas. I only have the data done so far from last year, from 2024, because it takes a really long time to pin the things. Sebastian's been curating the specimens for me. And then it takes me upwards of sometimes 45 minutes a bee to ID it to species. It's a long, long process. And so I have 2024 data on who was nesting where. And there were a lot of nests overall in the grassland at certain times of year, but there were different and more species in the forest. So the story got more complex even than I thought. There were a small cosmopolitan group of bees that were prolific in the grassland, but the majority of the bee diversity was happening in the forest. And I can't show you this without taking you out to this golf course and walking you through the field with me so you could experience it. If I was standing on the putting green, be like, this is dumb, I'm never gonna find anything out here, and hunting for nests, walk 10 feet away into the forest. I'm like, I'll just go in the forest when my time was up. And it was like walking into the dorm room next to yours and discovering 100 people in there having an enormous party if you were sitting alone in your dorm room. And the forest was the happening place, but only in the spring. And then the action picked up in the grassland later in the summer with a lot of other cool things that were indeed using the sand pits. So that was what I was hoping to see. And it really tells the story about complementarity of habitats. And it confirms what we thought and what we've talked about a million times over lunch break, that you need both habitats together, and that bee conservation is a complex story, like a lot of ecological stories. You need all these different habitats. Here's some of the cool bees that I found, then I'm going to pass it off to Mike. This one was relatively new invasive species that had only been documented 2 or 3 times in the state. So that was neat. And it's a European wool-carder bee. This is a wasp that I thought was a bee at first, because I went back to the site many times to try to collect it, and it kept poking its head down the nest and I couldn't get it. And I found out that it's a wasp that specializes, it's called ant queen kidnapper, I'm sorry, because it specializes, it only eats, the only food that it eats in the whole world are ant queens of one specific species during the time of swarming. When a bunch of big juicy queens come out, the only winged life cycle stage of the ant flying out, there's a wasp timed perfectly with its life cycle to eat it during the 3 days that the ants are swarming. It blew my mind, I love it. And then here's one of my favorite great big green sweaties that I found a nesting aggregation of. That was very encouraging. So the story continues. This is one small beginning to the story. I explained some of the key methods now that pollinator biologists use. That's why I spent a little more time on the first project. But key ideas for complementarity of habitats, forest plays a huge role. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike to tell you more about the forest component and a big picture, landscape and regional scale of some big patterns.
So we're going to, the title of the manuscript is in regards to best management practices for bee conservation within these forest openings. We're going to condense this humongous study into just a few slides. So we're not actually going to go over the best management practices, but we're going to highlight some really important findings that lead to the long document of the best management practices. So this is work that I did just pre-Hiram over at UMass. And I was working with my advisor at the time, Dr. David King, and Jody Milam, who is an incredible ecologist and taxonomist, as well as Eliza Fassler, who is and was a PhD student / candidate now. So this study spreads the entire Great Lakes Basin. It involved all 6 national forests within there, all the way from Superior up in Minnesota down to the Finger Lakes in New York. All the white dots in here you see represent an opening, a site in which bees and plants and a lot of other environmental variables were measured. This is all due to a huge co-production effort, collaborations with the National Forests, and where their staff was actually conducting these experiments simultaneously using a standardized protocol. And I was not there for that setup, I will throw that out there, but that is like a crazy huge feat. So I was hired to do the analysis of this humongous data set. That was my postdoc. And I do want to clarify that, because this came up a lot throughout the last 4 or 5 years. When I say opening, I don't mean a canopy gap. I mean, yes, we had a couple that were only 1 hectare in size, but this is within a forest matrix. So imagine a landscape that's dominated by forest, and then there are these large openings, and up to, say, like 200 plus hectares in size. So there's a lot of variety in there, but I'm not talking about like a 1/4 acre, gap that we see when a couple really large trees fall down. And the majority of these are managed. So what we are looking at is what has been going on in the last 20 years. Thankfully, the National Forest Service has been able to keep these records, and they provided them to us, and that was incorporated within the analysis. So the objectives, we really had 2 for the study. One was to provide a baseline data on the bee species distribution and status across these national forests, because up till this point, this really wasn't a key focal area being funded, with some exceptions, and then to gauge the relative effects of opening treatments to inform management. So we're going to get pretty deep into this now with the stats, since that's my area. But so overall, from that data set, there were over 14,000 bees, and this was all being sampled by bee bowls that you already were exposed to, as well as target netting, which I think is also what you were just exposed to. But to clarify the difference between target and sweep, this is not a transect. Target, you have a local area, and when you are targeting a specific bee, whether it is on the flower or on the vegetation, or flying and you're running in and capturing it. And that information is recorded. So for just the target netting, and we also had opportunistic, but for those, this is what we ended up with. So over 14,000 specimens of over 234 species. This bee-flower interactions is true, but this is not what was supposed to be on here. We also the staff also recorded the flowers in bloom around each bowl, so 1 meter from each bowl. And this ended up with nearly 30,000+ records of blooming flower presence. So this is an ordination of the bee community. For those of you not familiar with the ordinations, this is, if you imagine that every species is a different dimension, this is trying to cram it all down into, in this case, 2 dimensions, so you can see who's more similar site-wise than others. So how similar is one community compared to another based on the sites collectively. So in any of these type of ordinations, when you see 2 dots closer together versus maybe 2 dots that are further apart, that indicates that they are closer related. So remember, we're not talking about just one species versus another. We're talking about a site that has, say, 40 species and another site that has 20 species. So when you take into consideration the relative amounts of all those different species within each site, how does that pan out? Where does that fall out onto species space? That's what this is. Anything close to the origin here, this is a 0,0 origin, you will say. Anything close to, or say spot on the origin, is indicative of a very common ubiquitous species, widespread and rather abundant. Now, there can be exceptions to that, but if you had such a case, this is where it would be. So when you get out here, whatever the species is, it's very uncommon. It wasn't found on many sites, and all right. The DBRDA axes. This specific ordination is quantifying how the bee community and their differences change along an environmental gradient. In this case, there were many environmental gradients. These were the statistically significant ones that are in the publication. All right, that's the basis behind this ordination. The important part to see is that all the dots appear to be going along in some sort of direction, right? And what we can see is that there's a direction heading, like if we were to ignore where these axes are and create our new axes of what direction things are headed linearly, then we see an axis going this way and an axis going this way, right? And then what we can do is correlate, look hard. And what we can do is correlate our, these are called biplot arrows, our relationships to see how strong that relationship is. So ultimately what we see here is really focused on texture. That's really what I want to get across with this. It's texture and to some degree diversity with the plant community. By texture, sorry, I have clay organic, but I should explain that. Soil texture. So Jessie has already talked about how the literature is largely kind of caught up on sandy soils being really great for bees. And that is where bees nest. Well, there's a lot of places out here that don't have sandy soils. They span the entire gradient all the way down to super clay. It doesn't mean that bees aren't there. In fact, Telothrix bombiformis, the one in the opening slide, that is a clay soil specialist. So we have this gradient. Now we can look at the plant community, because remember, all these blooming plants, we have their presence, so we can get a relative understanding of their quantity, and we have their identity. So we look at how that plays out. And we see, again, they're responding, and this makes sense, they're responding to the texture of the soil. And this was actually a really great fit, and it helped with the BMPs, but it tells us that the plant community is changing really strongly to have the distance from the nearest forest edge. So basically what we're seeing here are edge effects. Often you can interpret that as like forest encroachment into the open. Now, what I don't show you is one more ordination that looks at the two communities together. And it's called a co-correspondence analysis, but if there is a missing gap that doesn't make sense, that is where that data came from. And if you would like to know about that, please talk to me about this. So in summary, broken down probably a little more clear of what our findings actually showed is that in clay conditions, we ended up, we are inferring that it was resulting in a plant community that was rather dense, so pretty high in abundance, if you will, and where if we this is obviously just a schematic, but that has a pretty decent diversity, but all in all is very dense. And this was because there were a lot of grasses associated with these clay communities, along with many more woody invasives and actually a lot of forbs as well. And then in our sandy conditions, we see different species, but they are much more sparsely spatially on the landscape. The co-correspondence is indicating that the plant community was actually affecting our bee community. All right, that's what I'm missing here. But this bee community in clay soils was different than the bee community in the sandy soils. Now, part of that, like I said, is due to the plant community. And we know that not just from the stats, but looking at their life histories, it makes sense because a lot of the bee species that we have here, we can look at their life histories and know, you know what, this bee is specific to clay soils. This bee, we know, is specific to nest in this plant, which only grows in sandy soils. So we can put that apart, tease that apart. But our DBRDA, the ordination I showed you also indicated a direct link between the soil and the bee community itself. So what is happening is that due to the clay soils, we are seeing fewer bees. So the abundance goes down. The diversity, not necessarily. In the sandy soils, we see the opposite effect. And so in some regards, this is in line with all the rest of the literature saying that sandy soils is really good for bees, right? Because that is what we see. We see a high diversity, we see a lot of abundance, but what's missing is that these are just different bees than what are here. These bees' life histories are not a lot of those tiny sweat bees that live in really large social colonies. Instead, these are a lot of usually solitary bees. So their numbers naturally aren't going to be as high. So different features like that. All right, now the management component. So, and this is really crazy and leads up to the next thing. So our mowing and brush hogging, there was herbicide being applied, mechanical practices being applied, which was largely brush hogging, and there was prescribed burning, there were pollinator plantings. I mean, we had the whole gambit, and we had 20 years worth of data from all 100 sites. All right, so with the brush hogging, we found a non-significant, but in a positive direction, effect on the bee community. And this, I'm just going to summarize abundance and diversity on clay soils. In sandy soils, we actually saw a significant negative effect. So that was kind of interesting. Then we looked at prescribed burns. Overall, again, we see a non-significant positive effect, with the bees in the clay soils, a strong positive effect of bees in the sandy soils. The kicker is when we had if every site that had been mowed or brush hogged And then within 2 years, on average, 1.5 years, it was burned. And this is just low intensity burning, right? Nothing crazy. Then we had, again, nothing crazy going on in the clay soils, but in our sandy soils, we had this synergistic positive effect, like truly synergistic. More than double what the positive effect that we saw just with prescribed fire alone even. So the question then is, what could be causing this? Well, when we look at the rest of our data and our results, we start to think about vegetation structure combined with the substrate, the preferred substrate that bees of these different habitats need for nesting. So when you mow or brush hog, what are you doing? I'm asking. Hopefully I didn't put you to sleep already. What happens when you mow? What happens to the vegetation? Does it get burned up? All right, chop it. Where does it go?
Right down.
Yep, it just gets spread around, right? So now you have a lot more debris on the ground. What do we know about the plant community between these two? Is it sparse or dense? Sparse. Are we likely to have a lot more exposed soil at these sites compared to a very dense site with a lot of grass? Yeah. So that would make sense for the negative effect. And this being very dense probably already has a lot of debris on the ground. Okay, so we see not much going on there. That makes sense. All right, now let's burn it. So if we burn it, what happens to the vegetation structure? Is it eliminating it, reducing it? Maybe a mix of both?
Yeah, I think it's changing it.
Yeah, right. Okay, changing it. So what else could be happening? What is actually on fire? If it's changing it, what's actually on fire in regards to opening up potentially more bare soil? That's right, yeah. So all the debris that's already on the ground. So that gets burned up, and now you have a lot more exposed soil for these bees that are using the cue of exposed soil for preferred nesting location. Now, what happens if you first chop it down and then you burn it? See where that's going? So that is our working hypothesis, but this is as far as I'm aware, well, this is the first demonstration or closest to the demonstration of it out there. Which leads to the next study. So this is a pretty long title. We should just go with grassland experiment, but management effects on the spatial distribution, and that'll make sense in a minute, of nesting bees in an ongoing prairie restoration. So this is an amazing collaboration with Jessie as well as our land stewardship manager, Zach Fox, at the station. And let's see, where do we go first? All right, so we've already talked about the management effects. We are going to be replicating this, just going to throw that out there, where we have control, where we do nothing to it, and then a prescribed burn, where we mimic or simulate a brush hogging, and then where we brush hog it and then burn it. All right, so we're going to do this on a plot scale, highly replicated. But there's a catch, and this is something that all the data that the Forest Service had wasn't going to be able to tease apart. And something that when we all talked about this potential study, something that needs to be taken into consideration is spring versus fall fires. They're going to be selecting for different plants, species-wise and just largely functional-wise. And then nesting aggregation. Jessie was bringing this up a lot on, it's not just, and actually even in this talk, she already talked about it, but there are some bees that will kind of nest off by themselves under a clump of grass or something. And then we saw a picture where there were lots of holes. So there was a nesting aggregation. So some species aggregate together. Some species are by themselves. Some species are social. So there's like thousands coming out. Others are solitary. Like we have the whole gambit, right? So we need to be able to take that into consideration in some degree. So on that note then, what causes those different behaviors? What makes, we know that from Jessie's work that you can guess and standardize where protocol where you're going to put your emergence tents, and you could get nothing. And then if you get lucky, you put it on the right spot, you get all kinds of beats. So what's going on? So we can take a look at that in regards to preferred suitable nesting habitat loss versus the fragmentation. And then of course, ultimately what's super important is that when we get it, everything's going, is that the students are able to carry these studies out. So, I give you the Tetris plots. All right. Ultimately, all you really need to know is that the different colors or patterns represent a different treatment. The four we've already talked about. The strips you see in here were already in play. This is something that Zach had already been doing, and they are experimental prairie plantings. And then we have our Tetris plots. These are 2 meter by 2 meter squares, all right? And they are separated by 4 meters. And they are just spaced as best as we could make them. Now, to get at the different seasonality, we split them up. So in the red square is actually what's going on in regards to, let's see, burning in the fall. So this is what we're doing right now. And then because there are less in this row, we had to grab a couple so they overall all evened out. But now we have to actually take just a diagram and actually implement it. And that's the hard part, is turning an idea into a reality. So thankfully, we have very committed students that rain or shine are out there measuring and staking, marking out these plots, and then you see all this sumac in the background. For starting conditions, at least, all that had to go. So there was a lot of loppers involved, but they're troopers. So that's, for the most part, all I have right now. We literally started treatments today. I'm going to show you this plot right here. This is a burn, cut and burn plot. And this is what it looked like before. This particular plot had a lot of rubus in it, so a lot of briars. Thankfully, I was the one behind the camera. So poor Zach was the one simulating the brush hogging, and by that it's just taking the edge trimmer and going down every 8 inches until you get to about 6 inches up, which is about where the depth of the brush hog would be. But afterwards, we see what we would expect: a lot of debris on the ground, and you know what? Soon we're going to burn it, and we'll see what happens. I'm going to pass it off, but I do want to just ask, what's one potential catch that I haven't talked about, but I emphasized the importance of in the last study? This is something we can't necessarily control, but we can measure. It has to do with the soil.
The different kinds?
No, what?
The different kinds of soil that are there?
Yes, in what way? Texture.
Yeah.
Texture.
Okay.
All right, so thank you, and I'm going to pass that back on.
Oh, very good. It's really exciting to see these kinds of plants come out of the lab and out into the field in actual practice. Brings this nerdy glee, and also has important management applications. This is going down tomorrow, right? The burning?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we should be burning from beginning probably around 1 or 2 o'clock tomorrow. So if you want to come out, watch your health. It'd be awesome.
And I've been told that there will be multiple flamethrowers so that multiple students can participate, right? In this, so come if you dare. Okay, so grasslands are one very important habitat for bee nesting, and in there we hope to find, do you remember the video I showed you of the bee hunting in the grasslands, the large sweat bees, or the brightly colored sweat bees, things that will nest in summer, will utilize the grasslands, and also stem nesting ones that might not survive the fire, but might take advantage later of the chopping of the brush after. So that's one side of the nesting story in terms of habitat. The other side is forest. Oh, I forgot one other project that we're also going to work on in the theme of doing experiments on bee nesting in the grasslands. We have a lead on a potential project we might get to do at the Cuyahoga Valley National Park with a collaborator of ours. This is Professor Randy Mitchell at the University of Akron. He's an excellent ecologist, and believe it or not, that's his favorite picture of himself. He told me that once. I said, don't you have a better picture? He goes, no, it captures the essence of doing science, especially outdoor science, where you stand there and you go, what is that? And so I practice in the mirror. I try to replicate that look so that someday I can get there. But he's an excellent biologist and invited us to collaborate with him on the old Richfield Coliseum site. And I was never there when it was a basketball arena, but I guess this was the former home of the Cleveland Cavaliers basketball team, and is now an enormous 80-acre grass field, and that they're very interested in doing something with to promote wildlife. And he said, you biologists there, he said, attention biologists in the Cleveland area, tell us what you'd like to try to make this more valuable to wildlife. And he said, bee people, what have you got? And we went, we could dump a dump truck full of sandy soil there and see if the bees come and nest in it. And he's like, done. And we're like, really? Oh, yes. And so it is in theory happening maybe this fall, maybe next spring, pending government shutdown stuff, logistics. So so stay tuned, maybe hopefully next year for that. I'm excited about that. We have one other project to share with you tonight. We talked about managing grasslands better for bee nesting, and now I'll tell you a little about managing forests too. And this last experiment took place in the woods behind Bonney Castle. Have you hiked back there before? Mm-hmm. There's a lovely, like a half an hour walking trail it takes you. And if you'll notice at the start of it, the first half a mile on the trail is garbage from a plant biologist perspective. It is full of invasive plants. I take my botany class there just to teach them about invasive plants. Look at all this stuff that's invaded the forest. It's everything that the field station forest is not, and that we hope to never let the field station forest turn into. So the field station has pristine, old growth beech maple forest. And there behind Bonney Castle, you find this. This is English ivy, which is one of a number of invasive vines that can carpet the forest floor so entirely that you can't even see the soil that is essential for bee nesting. And so that was one of several that we were interested in. Another, I didn't put a picture up here, but it's called vinca, which is a very pretty purple flower. And so we looked at all this and went, this has to go for bee nesting, but it seemed like a gargantuan task, so we designed an experiment instead to remove small patches, small doable patches of the vinage and see if it promoted bee nesting. And so I started this last spring with 3 excellent research credit students that helped me out last April. And those are Austin, who's going to tell you about the results later, because he said, I kind of like this. I'd like to do this for my capstone research. And I said, perfect. I'd like you to keep collecting more data. Do this for your capstone. So he'll share with you the results. Nathan T. also helped me remove vegetation. Hi, Nathan. And started out the experiment, and then moved on to a different internship in the summer. And another student, Ella, helped also. So Nathan and I went out there last April and removed of these vines, these pesky vines, from 32 different pairs of 1 meter plots. But only half of them, 32 plots, pairs of plots total, but only half of them thus far had been invaded with the dread invasive vines that carpet the forest floor. So the plots in yellow on here, which are closer to Bonney Castle, I think this one is Bonney Castle, one of those two. So if you hike back in here, you encounter mats of greenery on the forest floor that should not naturally be there, that are an invasive vine species. So all the ones in yellow are where that vine has oozed its way into the forest floor. And we randomly selected 16 spots to remove it in 1 meter squared plots. And we left a 1 meter squared control plot beside it with the vines intact. Because I thought long and hard about this complexity of bee nesting problem. And who says the vines are a bad thing? And I thought about last year when I gave a library forum talk and Mark said, who said invasive plants are a bad thing? And I went, maybe Mark is wise. And so one possibility with plant invasions is that they're actually making the habitat more suitable for bees by allowing bees to escape from their natural enemies, by allowing them to hide more effectively on the forest floor. So to get at that question also, we had another, great, now we need more plots. And so we had another set of 16 plots that were in the uninvaded parts of the forest where, to mimic disturbance there, we just tossed the leaf litter and left it all in place. So then for the control plots that were uninvaded, we had ruffled up leaf litter that we did the same thing to as the vines, but without the vines. And leaf litter that was left in place with no vines. So there are 4 different treatment types, and we're looking to see how it turned out. So the key bee players in this, we haven't talked so far about bee genera, because there's a lot of them, and the 2 key players that motivated this experiment were the spring mining bees. I mentioned earlier that the sweat bees are about 1/3 of our bee fauna, and the spring mining bees are another really hefty chunk of species diversity here that are tied to the forest for nesting. And you can see them facing each other in an internal competition. Their arch enemy are the genus Nomada, which sounds like nomad, because they don't build a nest. They just wait for the hardworking spring mining bees to make the nest, and then they're like, great, thanks. When they go out foraging, they sneak into the nest when the female mining bee is gone, lay their egg in its place, and when their larva hatches, it has the most fearsome jaws you've ever seen on any creature. And it eats the larva that's there and takes its place. So one common name for it is a cuckoo bee. Like there's cuckoo birds that do this too, displace the egg if it's there. So sneaky ne'er-do-wells, locked in eternal competition, usual bee things. And so it could have played out 2 ways when we removed these vines. It could have opened up opportunities again for bee nesting that the vines impeded, or it might have helped them escape nest parasitism by the parasite bee, the nomad bee. And so to tell you how it turned out, Austin will tell you about the results.
Hello everyone. So we observed each of the plots twice, and each observation was 10 minutes. So in total, we had 448 bee observations, and that was on average about 7 bees per plot, plus or minus about 5 bees. And so this figure here is showing the total bee observations, as well as the behaviors that the bees were showing at the time of the observation. And so 47% of these bees were only just flying through the plots, so they really weren't showing interest in the contents of the plots, so we kind of just threw those to the side, so those were not included on there. But 35% of the bees were showing nest or host-seeking behaviors, and that's shown in the yellow there. And then 4% of the bees were actually actively nesting, so those ones were the bees that were going in and out of nests or actually digging and burrowing. And the 4%, that is only 12 nests that I did find, and only 2 of those nests were in the plots with the vine present. Most of the nests were also in the vines removed or the leaves undisturbed, and that is for the bulk of the nesting behavior as well.
Sorry,
Okay, and then this one is showing the different types of bees that we saw. So there were a total of 8 different genera, and the most common were the cuckoo bees at 58%, followed by the Andrena bees at 24%. So that does show that there is enough of the Andrena nests around to support the nomadic community, because that is the parasitic bee that Jessie was talking about. And then some of the other bees that we found were the bumblebees, the Bombus genera, which only accounted for 10%. And then all of the other bees, which is represented by the gray, we didn't see them very often through our observations. They were pretty infrequent. As we can see, most of the observations were in the vine removal plots, but the abundance is about the same. All the proportions are pretty equal. So there were still bees present within the vines. So if you want to hear more about this research project, I am going to be doing my capstone presentation next Tuesday at 6 o'clock if you want to come listen to me talk a little bit more about the bulk of this presentation. So I'll hand it back to Jessie for conclusion.
I'll leave you with a couple thoughts in concluding this talk. And you probably might not all go on to be biologists, but I'd like to think for a minute how you can apply some of these common themes to your own self, to wherever you are in your career. If you're still a student, or even if you're in a totally different field that's not even the sciences, that's the beauty of these library forum talks, talking to people from other disciplines, learning in general what's going on campus. So I wanted to leave you with a few questions. And the first and foremost on my mind was, what's the hard problem that you can tackle in your discipline, that you have the ability to do? What's something in your field that everybody talks about when you get together with others of your kind at a conference, but people aren't actively doing as much as they should? Like bee nesting is a tough problem. People have been for years like, yeah, why just plant flowers when nesting is really the key thing in the life cycle? So this series of case studies we presented you shows you a little bit about the story of bee nesting and also a lot about our own evolutionist scientists, how we went from surveys and big data, small data, putting together all these pieces and then turning it into experimental manipulations and trying to involve students along the way so they can see this process too. And I also would like you to think about who can you collaborate with, whether you're a student or faculty or anyone, who can you surround yourself with that makes you want to be the best version of yourself and pushes you further in your academic journey or in your science journey. And if you are faculty in here, how can you do this with students too? Do the great things that you're doing, that you love to do, but also add some students into your research. So here's some students working in the lab. And if anybody wants to stick around, I don't know, we're at an hour mark time-wise, but if you've got time for a few questions, we're happy to answer those. And here's all of our contact information. If you want to get hold of us by email, if you want to find us in person, good luck. Come find us somewhere out in the woods at the field station, or occasionally a stop by Gerstacker to teach class. Okay, cool. Thank you all so much for listening, and a big round of applause for Austin, too.